Okay, welcome back. In this last segment of the unit, we're going to talk about this so-called Aryan debate and how it's had a kind of divisive impact on the study of ancient Indian history. Oftentimes, actually, I should say it's not really much of a debate, as more like a shouting match. And I think ultimately it has been detrimental to the study of ancient Indian history, all this shouting and yelling at each other. Now, in case you missed it, let's go again. Let's go over again who the different sides are in the debate or shouting match. First, there's the AIT, the Aryan invasion theory, which was first proposed in the 19th century by Europeans, and the idea was that there was this race of Aryans who spoke Sanskrit, and they invaded India and destroyed the IVC cities and pushed the Dravidian race down into South India. This kind of simple theory has now been rejected by and large by scholars and replaced by the AMT as the standard scholarly theory. AMT says that the Aryans are an ethnic group who spoke Sanskrit, they herded cattle and sheep, they rode horses, they did fire rituals. But AMT says that these Aryans didn't invade into India, but they came to India slowly in many, many different waves. And they integrated with the existing rural cultures, especially in the Punjab area, to create kind of a hybrid new culture. And all of this happened long after the IVC cities had already collapsed and disappeared. This has become the established scholarly model to explain how Indo-European speakers are found in India. Now, the other side of the debate wants to argue the opposite, right? That Aryans were actually the inhabitants of the Indus Valley cities, and they migrated out of India to Persia, to Central Asia, to Europe. Now, as Troutman says in this article that we should be reading, because this is the alternative theory, its proponents, the proponents of the OIT, have a burden of proof that they have to meet in order for their theory to be accepted. So in other words, if you want people to buy your new theory, you have to, and let go of the one that they already have, you have to show that your theory fits the data and the evidence that's available better than the old theory. But right now, the theory that best fits all the data, it seems like, and not just some of the data, is the AMT. Now let's take a closer look at what I mean. The linguistic data is kind of indisputable, I have to say. There's no doubt that the languages of northern India, which we're calling the Indo-Aryan languages, must have been derived from must have been closely connected to the ancient languages of Persia, with which they had a common ancestor. This subfamily is unmistakably also related to most of the classical and modern languages of Europe, to Hittite and Armenian and a bunch of other languages kind of in the Central Asian area. Anyone who would challenge the currently accepted AMT theory has to somehow account for this linguistic evidence. Also, it's pretty clear that there were no horses and chariots in the Indus Valley civilization. But there are tons of them in the Vedas, which are the oldest Indo-Aryan texts, the Sanskrit texts. The Vedas also show very clearly that the people who created the Vedas did not really lead an urban life, but rather they were pastoralists who herded cattle and sheep in the countryside. And they didn't have access to all these like crazy technologies of the IVC, like sewers and toilets or bead-making workshops. There's one single exception, which is bricks, right? Brick making is thought to have been something that did get absorbed from the IVC into Vedic culture. But everything else in the Vedas speaks to quite a different lifestyle, a different culture than what we found digging in the dirt in the IVC. So anyone who wants to debunk the AMT theory and provide a different theory has to also account for this kind of archaeological evidence, linguistic data, cultural data, and not just choose bits and pieces of data that support the OIT claims. And it's not enough to attack the AIT, which has already been rejected. Of course, this kind of thing rarely happens within the debate, and the reason for this, again, in my opinion, is because the debate has, for all practical purposes, left the academic world and instead has entered into the public arena, where all that counts is fiery rhetoric and flashiness to prove your point. Many people in India really like the OIT also because it tells them that the IVC culture was Hindu and that all European cultures basically come from India. Right? And so it reinforces some chauvinistic ideas that we Indians, we Hindus, have the oldest and greatest culture and that we're better than the Europeans and so on. Right? So it's kind of a populist appeal, and it's compelled politicians, activists, armchair scholars, hobbyists to enter into the Aryan debate and to take up the OIT, especially on the internet. Many of the leading proponents of OIT are like Indian physicists or engineers or doctors and so on. They're smart and well educated, but they don't know how to dig an archaeological site. They don't really even know Sanskrit for that matter. They have scientific PhDs, but they don't have advanced training in archaeology or comparative historical linguistics or Vedic studies or anything like that. That kind of training is what's really needed to be able to understand the evidence and to distinguish good data from bad data. It's a bit like if you or I tried to read engineering reports or legal briefs or MRI scans. We can read them, but we'd have no way to make any sense of what they're saying. Right? But because it's super easy to broadcast whatever your opinion is on the internet, I guess like what I'm doing right now, and because some of the OIT folks are really savvy with Twitter and Facebook and other social media, the debate has now gotten tied to politics, right, in the public arena. And so it's gotten really nasty. And a number of very nice and decent scholars in India and North America who I know them, they've been harassed and personally attacked, especially on Twitter, which is the worst, as being anti-Hindu or anti-Indian or communist or whatever. Meanwhile, ordinary, well-intentioned Hindus in India and North America who are honest and who are really curious about their own fascinating ancient past get misinformed by all this stuff about what scholars are really doing. There's a lot of conspiracy theories and so on. And I should say at the same time, scholars sometimes find it really hard to explain their findings and their latest theories to the general public because it's usually the things that they're working on is usually really technical stuff. So all that the public gets is this sort of cheap boilerplate messages that the activists keep shoving down your throat in Twitter and on YouTube. It's fake news, basically. Scholars' opinions get distorted or sound awful. People drudge up outdated work from like 75 years ago, like Mortimer Wheeler or whatever, and say this is what people say today. So people in India often think that foreign scholars believe in the Aryan invasion theory, when in fact the AIT's been kind of entirely rejected in favor of the AMT. So is there something that we can do about all this? Or is the topic of Aryans always going to provoke kind of hostility and anger? Are there any solutions? I'm not saying that I have any kind of magic answer, and maybe I'm wrong about what I say or what I think, but I do think that if any solution is to come out, the first thing we have to do is to depoliticize this debate. Right? Nobody knows for sure what's going on in the ancient past. And we should follow certain rules of decency and decorum when we're talking about them. This means that all arguments should be based on the evidence that we see, not just on rhetoric, and random kind of fake news stuff shouldn't get passed off as being good scholarship. And maybe the debate shouldn't also be taking place on Twitter or YouTube or whatever. Maybe it should be taking place in classrooms and quiet places. But more than anything else, depoliticization to me means that we have to start speaking to each other with mutual respect. People, whether they support AIT, AMT, OIT, whatever it is, they're starting to display an appalling lack of respect and decency towards each other, towards the other side of the discussion. Some of them have adopted a rhetoric of violent confrontation. They call it a battle for Sanskrit or a war on academic freedom. This kind of militarized language, I think, only encourages mean-spirited behavior and impatience with the other side since they've been now declared to be the enemy. It doesn't help to call people that. More than anything else, I think people, if they can get along as friends, then even if they have a difference of opinion, They can have a reasoned discussion about it and not a shouting match. But I do wonder if friendship is something that either side currently wants with one another. Another thing that I think would help is if we can decouple the idea of race or ethnicity or religious identity from language. Right? We sometimes assume that because people speak Sanskrit that they have to be Aryan or Hindu or Indian, but languages can enter into areas without ethnic migrations. Right? Take a look at everywhere English has traveled to without English people settling in all these places. Sanskrit itself was imported into Southeast Asia in the first millennium. So it could really easily have been that Indo-Aryan languages came into South Asia without mass migrations of people, even in the prehistoric past. It's possible. In the same way, I think it's really natural and tempting for scholars and ordinary people alike to cling to easy narratives. Right? Stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Stories have protagonists and things that protagonists have to do to overcome challenges and defeat the bad guys. And this kind of thing makes sense. Right? Stories make sense to us. But real life isn't actually made up of stories. Social histories, what happens to communities over long periods of time, is always a complex set of events that can never be completely captured by a single story. So no theory, AIT, AMT, OIT, or whatever, will ever perfectly capture what happened over 1,000 years of history. It's just not possible. For example, there could have been many hundreds or many thousands of migrations instead of just one big one. People could be migrating both east and west at the same time, right? It could be a two-way road, not a one-way road. And populations were almost certainly intermingling and intermarrying in all the points in between these migrations. Also, the Indus Valley probably was a multicultural environment where there more than one kind of ethnic group lived together. There's many different groups who lived together. They intermarried, they shared each other's cultures like all cities do, right? No single story would be able to capture all the different kinds of lives that lived in the Indus Valley civilization for hundreds of years. So maybe the best thing we can do is to admit that we can't really ever tell the complete story of how speakers of Sanskrit came into India. Instead, maybe we should pay more attention to the kind of still huge task of gathering more evidence, more data that we can analyze, and then trying to make rational sense of it rather than fighting bitterly with one another over figuring out which of these two theories is correct. Both of the theories are ultimately insufficient to explain what really happened in the prehistoric past. Again, all of this is just my opinion. I could be wrong. I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say about it and whether you have any solutions to solving this kind of difficult situation in the South Asian Academy. So send me your reactions and I'll see you in our next session when we start talking about Vedic literature and culture.